Hi everyone, I'm Keith DeStone, and I'm here again with Greg Nagy and Claudia and Sarah and Casey and Hélène for um, Heroes Office Hours. And we're going to be talking about hours 3 and 4 and 5 today, and picking up a bit from where the discussion ended last time. So, Greg, I know you want to do a quick intro to what Casey is
Yes,
going to talk about, and I'll start screen sharing the hour 3 and 4.
perfect. So while screen sharing begins, could I just say that uh, when we last met, uh, technically, some people may not have known what lament is. And I was already promising, well, the next time you'll really understand lament. But then I called on my dear colleague Casey about how the Iliad connects with lament. And we started talking about popular media and the science fiction film. This is the earlier version of this particular film, Blade Runner. And next thing you know, Casey took the ball and ran with it and compressed essentially what people should know about lament, even though technically we're going back to lament now. So I call on my dear colleague Casey to continue exactly where you left off.
So do you want me to just get started talking?
Well, for example, um, the picture that Claudia and I are showing on classical continuum, can somebody scroll? And there's that picture where Casey will explain what is going on there, but you could scroll a little further, a little further, a little further. Keywords.
Okay, I know, I know.
And 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 Casey, have a look at those keywords.
I
Ah,
know, I know what they are. Yes. I could
and
tell
so
already when I saw the vase, I knew.
so so you take it away.
Okay. So as we were talking last time, um, I brought up the idea that lament, this form of song that expresses grief, um, that it infuses the Iliad and is even like a foundational form of song for the composition of the Iliad. And the words for lament, well, one of the key words for lament is built into Achilles's own name because the word is akos. It's part of his name and has to do with the whole word. And I'm drawing on Professor Naj's own work here.
Oh,
Um,
let's not get so formal suddenly. By the way,
well,
Casey, what I now do to college students, sorry for the interruption, but what I do with college students is if you can't stand calling me Greg, then call me Professor Greg. But for heaven's sake, Casey,
okay. Well, I'm drawing on Greg's own work to say
much
that
better.
the etymology of Achilles's name is the akos for the laos, and the laos part of it is the host of warriors at the Trojan War. That's how you refer to the Achaeans as the laos. So Achilles both causes grief and experiences the most intense grief that you can feel during the course of the Iliad. And there's another word for grief and lament as well. Lament being, the song of grief, and that word is penthos. And it's just another word that also has to do with lament and grief and song. And so the vase is showing this really fascinating thing because it's from an episode that happens just outside of our Iliad in terms of the narrative of the Trojan War. And Achilles is battling the Amazon warrior Penthesilea. So she's a female. And Penthesilea also has these ingredients of grief for the people. But in this case, the two are coming together, the akos for the people and the penthos for the warriors. I'm sorry. Another way to translate laos is like the people, but meaning in this case, the people are the host of the warriors at Troy.
Yeah.
So these two monumental figures are coming together, and the story is that we know from evidence outside the Iliad that tells us about the other epics that had to do with the Trojan War, that Achilles is falling in love with Penthesilea as he's killing her. So this is just another aspect of the dynamic of Achilles that can be hard to understand when you first approach the epic, which is that he was an object of intense longing and love and eroticism in the ancient world. And so he could be, you know, this mighty warrior and this figure of grief, but also a figure that you could sing love songs about or compare to a bridegroom. And that may be, you know, that might jolt us a little bit to think about him that way, but that in the ancient world, you know, you could make people faint by talking
Yes.
about Achilles. I mean, he was the ultimate, gosh, I can't even think who to compare him to in modern times because, you know, Brad Pitt is an old man now, but 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 think along those lines. But even more, we would I think in modern times we might call someone, you know, godlike, you know, when we're talking about like a very attractive person.
Yeah.
It would say he's a god or something. But in Achilles's case, he is godlike, not just in his attractiveness and in his skills as a warrior, but also, you know, as the son of a goddess.
Yes.
And the thing is, he will always rival the gods. He'll be like the gods, but he is mortal. He's going to die. And so he can he can only approach being a god, but he'll never actually be one. And that's part of the grief that's all wrapped up in his story, because he not only, like I say, causes great grief with his withdrawing from the Trojan War and the losses that the Greeks suffer and things like that, but also by his own death, right? He causes so much grief for
Yes.
the warriors. But he also has grief for his own mortality, grief knowing he could have been the next ruler of the universe.
Yeah.
And of course, the story of the Iliad, I mean, we can't have spoilers, right? I mean, I can talk about
Oh, sure. No, spoil away. Spoil away.
okay. I can talk about the fact that his closest comrade, his other self, is going to die in the course of the Iliad and cause him, you know, as much grief as his own death. And so grief is just, and lament is just all wrapped up in the story of the Iliad, but we see it come together in a really fascinating way in this vase where he takes on the Amazon warrior Penthesilea.
I love it. And once again, Casey managed. Wow, you again did it sort of in 5 minutes. It's just amazing. You're a master of compression. Now I'm trying to remember, dear Casey, last time you and I talked with our colleagues here, um, did we talk about expansion and compression or
No,
no?
we did not. Would you
So
like me?
I would love it if you did a riff on expansion and compression.
Okay, so one of the things that is so fascinating to me about the oral tradition in which the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed, and also epics like the Aethiopis, which narrated events after the end of our Iliad, and including this episode with Penthesilea. But one of the things that's so fascinating about it is that you know, the performer is always, the composer and performer is always interacting with an audience and on different occasions, right? So you can imagine a wedding, you can imagine a festival that might go on for days. You can imagine a long winter night when nobody has anything else to do but just sit in the dark. And you can see how a performer, on depending on the occasion and depending on the audience, might tell a more compressed version of the story or a more expanded version of the story. And in some ways, the Iliad is an extreme expansion, right? Because it's one episode told over 24 books. I mean, I say one episode, but I mean, the consequences
Yeah,
of one event told over 24 books, it would take days to perform, right? So in some ways it's an expansion, but because it's just one episode,
yeah,
we can imagine, and I don't know that this ever existed before, but we can imagine an expansion that went on for months. I mean,
sure, sure.
because if you started with say the Judgment of Paris or some other event in the earlier episodes in the story of the Trojan War, go back to sort of the beginning, to the extent that there's a beginning, go back to Achilles' birth, for example. You could drag out this story for a really long way. But what happens is, in oral performance, is that the singer, the composer and singer, will choose a starting point, right? And then go from there and either expand or compress as he interacts with the audience and gauges their interest, gauges the length of time available, gauges the occasion. And so, there could have been an Iliad that included uh, the story of Penthesilea. In fact, we know from ancient testimony that there are other ways of concluding the Iliad, because we have references to an alternative ending where instead of, thus they celebrated the funeral of Hector, the tamer of horses, and it goes on. And then an Amazon came, the daughter of Otrera, Penthesilea.
And Thessalia, yes, it's just amazing. It's just so amazing. I think you did such a beautiful job, Casey, of showing how it's all connected. And I'm sure when you talk to college age people who have still a lot of life to live, and I, as a much, much, much older person, can you imagine when I talk to college age people, and it's hard for them to connect all the dots about Achilles, and and you and I, as professors, usually don't give them enough time to read all of it well. So one thing that Claudia and I are experimenting with is doing what we'll call slow readings, and then I don't know what to call the other kind. Claudia, what would we call the other kind?
Um, well, quick reading.
Yes, quick reading. And Keith, since you're dealing with a different kind of group, w- do you have special ways of talking about expansion and
Right.
compression?
Yeah, the extension school version of this course. No, I fall back on the old slow and fast dichotomy. Yeah, downloading it. The Matrix is it still a cultural reference point? There's that part where he's learning martial art. The main character Neo is learning martial arts and various kinds of things just by having them downloaded into his brain. That's
I
for
love
me, the
that.
idea of fast reading is just get the story, the words into your brain. You can think them out later. Whereas the slow reading is you take the time to pick them apart.
I have an idea, and why don't we, any of us, jump in? If, dear Claudia, you could start scrolling down, I want people to see another key word that we played with. There it is. I think, yeah, there it is. Daimon. And
Yes.
I bet, I'm guessing, again, Casey can second guess me about why daimon, and maybe let's not go to our six text A, but further down. So here he's called, Patroclus is called uh, daimonisos, right?
Mhm.
But it's sort of out of context. But now, yes, there we go. So now, dear Casey, if you could tie that passage in Iliad 11 with this passage in Iliad 16 together, where again we have equal to a daimon. What's going on here? And why would this be possibly relevant to things we're going to talk more about?
Well, so like I was saying, Achilles is going to have this incredibly short, compressed life, right? We were talking about compression. But he's a almost superhuman force, like it's translated here, in that he's the son of a goddess and he's the best of the Achaeans, the best warrior, everything like that. And so he is frequently called godlike in the Iliad. He's almost the equivalent of a god. And in the course of the Iliad, Achilles withdraws from battle and the Achaeans start to lose. And many of their best fighters are wounded or otherwise taken out. And then Patroclus goes into battle in Achilles's place, and then he becomes the one who is like a daimon, who is like a godlike force.
Perfect.
And
Perfect.
as he's approaching his death, he is in that moment, godlike, just like Achilles is. And there are other moments in other sort of special, intense moments in the course of a life where you can be godlike. And one of them is on your wedding day, it seems, because
Yep. Yep.
in
Yeah.
in the lyric poetry of Sappho,
Yes.
we have
Yes.
references to a godlike um, groom.
Perfect.
So,
So dear Casey, hold it right there. Hold it
okay.
right there. So did everybody hear Casey saying that um, this kind of situation? And here's your spoiler. I told you we wouldn't have to wait long for the spoiler effect because Patroclus dies here, and he
Yeah.
dies and is described as equal to a daimon, which is the way you say it when you're not sure about the superhuman force. Hey, Casey, you notice I no longer say the way I used to when we were teaching together at Harvard. I no longer say supernatural. I try to avoid that in Greek
Mhm.
myth. It's superhuman because
Yeah.
when it comes to natural, well, I don't know. There, it's just not a very useful term anymore for me. So anyway, um, so not just at a moment when you die as a warrior, but at the moment when you get married, you can be called, if you're a man, equal to a god, either specified or unspecified, or if you're a woman, equal to a goddess. Um, Although it's said differently, and we'll get to that. But just for the fun of it, since Keith mentioned the Matrix, can you, Claudia, can you scroll to the next thing, which is our six text C? Yeah, those two. Um, when you read the Iliad in its glorified, expanded form, this is something I've been thinking about more recently. So, um, um, Keith and Casey, you might not have heard this,
I don't think I have.
but let me try it on you. And it has to do with the Matrix, which is that let's face it, when you go to Odyssey, I'll do a real spoiler alert. Let's go to Odyssey 24, where you have the funeral of Achilles. And so how is he known as the super warrior that he is, as somebody who's an expert in chariot fighting? And yet he never really does any chariot fighting in the Iliad because Iliad is too busy talking about his other stuff. Can I put it that way? So who does the chariot fighting? It's Patroclus, his alter ego. Oops, I used a term that we haven't used before, but maybe Keith, who has been teaching with me more recently, and Casey, who has been teaching with me less recently, can explain why I feel the way I do. But anyway, what I'm saying is it's Patroclus who's the great chariot fighter. Hector is the great chariot fighter. And it's in that, like that scene in Matrix, Keith, I think, where I don't know what the technological wizardry has to do with, but the good guy and the bad guy are rushing at each other. Okay, not on chariots, but somehow in a levitating, high-speed way. They're going to clash from one end of the screen to the other end and from the other end of the screen. And so that's what I think the Iliadic tradition is saying here, except that because it's so expanded, I don't want to say it this way, I shouldn't say it's cluttered, but you can't quite reconstruct the chariot warfare part, but clearly that's what's happening, I think.
Well, what I love is what these passages that you have up show is that the same traditional language is used to describe Patroclus and Hector.
Yes.
And at the same time, Patroclus is taking Achilles' place. He's substituting for him. You know, remember, Achilles is sitting out, so Patroclus comes in his place wearing his armor, right? And
Yes.
and he is in every way, Achilles-like, I guess we would say, instead of godlike, but he becomes godlike,
Yes.
like Achilles. And then in this approach with Hector, but we see the interconnections in the way the Iliad describes Achilles, Patroclus, and Hector. They kind of intertwine with one another, even exchange armor with one another, and all wear the same armor at various points, and are very, very closely interconnected in the structure of the Iliad. So that I think, Greg, you might, I know you didn't want to say it's cluttered, but I don't think you have to worry about an ancient audience
No.
understanding these connections, because they are steeped in this traditional data.
Yes.
So they know.
Oh,
They
exactly.
absolutely know everything that's happening. So, I mean, they know about, these words would just evoke all of this for them.
Oh, yes.
But I've lost my train of thought now. So maybe Keith should jump in.
No, but thank you.
Claudia has her hand up. Why don't you
Yeah.
pick up the train of thought, Claudia?
I was having a question for you, just the way you're talking right there. I love the way you're talking about right now, how how so much of this language is traditional, and so the audience would know all these things. And you talked about that a little bit last time. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, about what that means for an actual audience member to have the many different multiforms and different variants of these stories in their head and
Yeah.
listening, right? Because it's really hardwired into them.
Yes. Also, one of the researchers that Greg and I most admire is Albert Lord, and he talked about the language, or the he talked about oral poetry as being like a language.
Yeah.
And if you think of it that way, not as individual words, but as phrases and lines and themes and traditional elements of storytelling, as well as very particular phrases and verses. If you think about it that way as a language, you can think about how not only is the composer fluent in the language of the oral poetry that he's telling his tale in, but also the audience is fluent in this language.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so for them, when they hear, um, um, certain, well, I would argue every verse resonates, right? I would say every verse has resonance across the tradition, and it would for an ancient audience.
Yeah.
I mean that in a very cognitive way, that they would hear it and it would make all sorts of mental connections to the other times that they've heard these tales and these phrases being used. But if the same verse is used for Patroclus and Hector, and of course I'm thinking about, I keep not wanting to spoil the Iliad for some reason, but I keep thinking about how the
Okay.
same verse is used for the death of both Patroclus and Hector. So first Patroclus dies, and then the same verses are used for Hector's death.
Yeah.
And Achilles' death happens beyond the Iliad, but we can only imagine that the same exact verse would have been used for Achilles as well.
Yes.
So all of that just reinforces these traditional storytelling structures and the stories of these characters. And the audience doesn't have to actively think about that, because, like I say, they're steeped in the language. They're fluent in the language.
Yeah. I love that.
And so they don't need to think, oh, well, now I know these characters are connected. It's just
It's built in.
it's built in.
And,
But it's very powerful, I would say.
and you know, sometimes I make the mistake of rushing into this passage that Claudia is showing us here. And you could just scroll it up a little bit so we can see the whole passage. This text B thing. There we go.
Mhm.
And when we looked at the previous passage, it was like a dress rehearsal where Patroclus goes um, at Apollo once, twice, three times, and the fourth time Apollo says back off, and he backs off. This time, it's not a dress rehearsal; it's for real, and he doesn't back off. And there it is again. Um, uh, let's see, where is it? Thank you, Claudia. Equal to a superhuman force. You like that, Casey
Yeah.
and Keith? I don't call it supernatural. I call it superhuman.
Mhm. But a
Uh,
daimon, I think it's important for the students to know that a daimon can be a god. It can
oh
be a
yeah,
hero. You don't know exactly the nature of the force you're dealing with, but it's something not human, that's for sure. It's something more powerful than that.
ex-
I wonder
and-
if I could just ask a quick question, because at
oh,
the beginning,
please,
at the beginning
Sarah.
of this passage, we've got a different word for equal, atalantos, to
Yes,
swift Aries, and there's a specific god name. Is
yes.
this an equivalent but different phrase?
Well, this was driving me crazy a few years ago, Sarah, and unless either Casey or Keith want to chime in, well, let me try my thing and then see what Casey and Keith say. Is that when it comes to antagonistic relationship with a divinity who's most like you, most people have a single antagonism. Uh, when we get to the Odyssey, that's the most complex one. So let's not even talk about that. Um, on the other hand, Achilles, as a generic warrior, could be called Atalantos Arei, which means having the same weight as Ares, which means we're thinking of weighing their, how shall I say it, their essences on scales.
Yeah. So
You know,
the
so
weighing of souls in the Iliad when Zeus has to decide who's going to die now. Is it going to be Hector or is it going to be Patroclus?
exactly. So in a way, Achilles and his alter ego, Patroclus, are, shall we say, ritual antagonists of Ares as god of war because hey, they're warriors. But on the other hand, um, Achilles has a special antagonistic relationship with Apollo. They look alike. They're both very ha 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 musical. They both specialize in the lyre. So dear Sarah, would you accept the idea that in this passage, really, Patroclus as a stand-in for Achilles, it therefore has really two divine antagonists. There's his generic antagonist, who's Ares, but then there's the Achilles specialist antagonist, who's Apollo. So let's see what Sarah says, and then what we'll do in chronological order of who's worked with me longest. Sarah, then Keith, and then Casey.
Well, Keith had to leave, so.
Oh, all right. So it's Sarah and Casey.
Yeah, so I noticed that further down this passage, it is very specifically Apollo who is literally being an antagonist to Patroclus, who
Yeah,
is standing behind him and
yes.
knocking off his helmet and so on. So
I think we should make a committee and write this up as a comment because I think what you just said makes so much sense that 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 Patroclus isn't really an antagonist of Apollo. Only Achilles is, but he is kind of by substitution. Why don't you know what, Claudia? Why don't you appoint a committee of I'll do it in order of who's been at it longest. Me, Casey, Keith, and Sarah, and anybody else who wants to join. Claudia, you might want to join to write a quick comment about this.
Amazing. I love it.
I want to connect this passage back to lament in a way.
Thank you.
Maybe not this exact passage, but this where we are in the story. So Patroclus is approaching his death. We see him go up against Achilles, his own antagonist, the god Apollo. And at the end of this passage, Apollo smacks him on the helmet, knocks the helmet from him, and he is vulnerable in that very moment to death, and he is about to be killed. When that happens, it unleashes so much grief for Achilles himself, but even before Achilles, because Achilles doesn't know yet that Patroclus has died. So then we have to have a whole book of the warriors fighting for Patroclus's body and finding out about him being dead, and being shocked and grieving on the battlefield and having to fight for him.
Yes.
Or even Achilles finds out. But also from this point forward, everyone starts lamenting, not just for Patroclus, but for Achilles himself, because everybody knows that Achilles is going to die now, because they know he's going to come back to battle. So everyone starts mourning Patroclus and then Achilles at the same time. From this point forward in the Iliad, and they all predict Achilles' death, and Achilles says, I know, you don't need to tell me, I'm gonna die now. I get it.
Love it.
And so we're all simultaneously mourning the closest comrade Achilles has, his other self, and we're mourning for Achilles because he's going to go back to battle and die now young at the age of 18 or 19.
I love
it. And that profound grief is just, suffused throughout the Iliad. And what I want to say is that, and then in book 18, after book 17, everybody fighting and grieving and fighting at the same time. And Achilles finds out, and then he starts lamenting larger than life, right? His mother starts lamenting because she knows Achilles is going to die. Briseis even laments, and will continue to lament in book 19. But also we have this incredible moment where the goddess Thetis comes to Achilles, bringing him new armor, because now Hector is wearing the armor that was Achilles' armor.
Yes.
So Achilles needs new armor. And when she comes, she finds him, and he's thrown himself over the body. She finds Achilles thrown himself over the body of Patroclus, and he's lamenting. And he's lamenting just like a captive woman laments when she has fallen over the
beautiful
of her a soon-to-be captive woman, I should say, when she has fallen over the body of her husband that was slain in battle, and now she's about to be taken into captivity. That is what Achilles is compared to. That is what is going to happen in the course of the Trojan War. It has already happened in the Trojan War. Briseis is one of those women, and then Achilles becomes like one of those women. And all that grief, because the only way to convey the intensity of Achilles' grief is to compare him to a woman like that. And all of that is what is underlying the poetry of our Iliad.
Wow. That is amazing. That's stunning. And you help me see things that I never saw quite as clearly as I do right now. Thank you. Wow. Sarah, you have the last word. You have the last word.
If I may
Hélène,
I ask? Yeah. There's something that always intrigued me is, the expression daimoni ethos equal to a diamond appears about 10 times in the Iliad, but never appears in the Odyssey. And does that mean that these two words, this expression, is really specific to the Iliad? And I think it appears also later on in Sappho. But what can we say about the choice of the words that are specific to the Iliad and don't appear in the Odyssey, for example, like daimōn Isos.
Brilliant. You know what? I defer to Casey and Claudia on this one.
Well, I'll say what comes to my mind immediately, which is that when you think about the Iliad and Odyssey as oral poetry, it's not just the individual phrases and verses that are what we call formulaic, that are part of the diction, part of the vocabulary of telling this kind of story. They also have something we call themes, which just means like an overarching story structure. It's traditional. It would be recognizable, maybe not on a conscious level, but very recognizable for an audience. And it's also how the poet composes, is because remember, they're composing live on the spot and they're going according to particular themes. The Iliad overall is like a battle theme, basically. I mean, that's in most simplistic terms, right? It's an overarching like theme of battle. And the Odyssey is a totally different theme of homecoming, right? Of Nostos. There's a lot of sub themes within. I mean, like I say, this is the most simplistic way of looking at it, but the Odyssey is not in the same theme as the Iliad, and so because of that, they actually use different diction. They overlap, obviously, in some respects. There's, verse introductions and many other kinds of shared formulaic language, but there's also language that's specific to that theme. And I would say that daimōn Isos is part of this theme of, meeting your death in battle and being godlike in that moment. I don't even know, how specific it is to the specific sub theme of Achilles's, and Patroclus's story, but Odysseus is in a totally different kind of story. So that's my first reaction. But Claudia might have better things to say.
I for sure don't have better things to say. I mean, I think when I think about that phrase, daimōn Isos, it takes me back to my first time in your classroom, Greg. And, thinking about the formulation of here, I think one of the things you used to talk about are there are kind of three kind of core things about a hero, and one of them is antagonism. Well, in as a hero of myth, as opposed to ritual, there is antagonism between the hero and the god. And I think about that phrase as a phrase that is a way of encoding that antagonism. And going back to what you were saying, Casey, I feel like that antagonism, not that Odysseus does not have an antagonism with gods with whom he's associated, but it's just in a different environment. So those are the
Also, Odysseus has, like you were saying, I think multiple antagonists because he's a really complicated kind of hero. Quote Emily Wilson, a complicated man. But he's polytropos, right? So which means, well, the man of many turns, he can turn into many things, but he's a shapeshifter, chameleon, but he has different gods, right? So in my classes, I always talk about Athena, Hermes, and Poseidon, and even gods that seem to be on his side at times are also like his rival. He rivals them, I should say. He rivals them in certain skills and abilities.
Yeah, I mean, and when I think about that phrase in Sappho, I think about the way that as you are approaching that godlike state, when you're approaching that moment where you are getting to your greatest state, that is a trigger for that antagonism, right?
Yes, because of the rivalry issue. Like when you're approaching them, you're rivaling them. The heroes are always going to be almost there, but not there.
That's
Except
beautiful.
for maybe in
Well
these
said.
key moments, right? These key moments, like the moment of death and the moment of the marriage.
So if we think about also the aspect of the hero as a figure of cult worship, can you talk a little bit about, how we want to be thinking about that, like the multiformity of the hero? The hero is a figure of glory. He's a figure of grief, or she. They're a figure of antagonism with God, but then in ritual, they're a figure of symbiosis with the god, right? In
Right.
ritual. Yeah, so like it seems crazy that all that is happening, and then you yourself as an audience member, I think through the ritual of cult, gets to connect yourself to all that, right? Because
Exactly, exactly. So one of the things about heroes, just to keep on talking about lament, is
Sure.
that they inspire lament in cult, right? So there was cult lament of these heroes, um, like on the night before the Olympics, right? Mourning for Achilles. On, we have testimony from Pausanias that the women of the local area, like, mourned for Achilles, ritually mourned the night before the Olympics. I mean, I think that was true in other cults as well, not just Achilles, but so there's laments for heroes on the like religious level, as well as laments within the epic on like a narrative level. But they would have, I think, like we were talking about the tricks and stuff, but I mean, they think they would have resonated. I think laments within the Iliad probably resonate with the religious experience of the audience. And so, yeah, complex thing. And I'm not sure, even in, I've been probably teaching about it for 25, maybe 30 years, of, talking about the nature of the hero. And I'm not sure I can do it yet, but it is super complicated because you have to understand them as characters in a story, but not a new story, a story you've heard a million times, almost like I mean, I don't mean to like be specific to any one religion, but for me, the easiest connection is like Old Testament Bible stories, because you're supposed to already know all the characters already, and so, and on one level it's a story, but on another level it's a much more religious experience. um but and now I've lost my train of thought again, but I think it's a really great point that Claudia makes of the
Yeah,
complexity
beautiful.
of the hero and how to approach it on all these different levels, so that within the text they're like antagonistic with the gods because they're rivaling the gods, and then outside of that experience they are actually worshipped in conjunction with the gods. And so it's a tough thing to wrap your head around if you've never been exposed to the
Yeah, it's
topic.
really tough. And may I ask a question, Claudia? Is how many more minutes do we have? You're the timekeeper.
about 6.
How many?
6.
6. Okay, then is it all right if I go back to the challenge to Casey where I said, hold it right there? You were about to talk about weddings. So, dear Claudia, can you scroll down to Sappho 44? It's not,
Oh my God, yeah, that's an amazing text. Well, like I was saying in this passage, which is fragmentary, so that's why it reads that way. If you're just approaching this for the first time, it's important to know that it survives on a papyrus, so we have to sort of reconstruct the text a little bit. But we can see that it's a wedding song and that it's describing the characters of Hector and Andromache on their wedding day. And there are, now for me, I need to try to zoom up so I can actually quote the text for you. No, I can't. I wanted to make the text bigger so I can actually, I think I can now. Okay. So at the end, they're describing all the beautiful scenes, and even the people watching are called they look like the gods because they're all dressed up and they're beautiful in this moment. Everybody's going through the streets and they're calling on Apollo, who is, Achilles' god antagonist. They call on Apollo, the healer, the far shooter, the master of playing beautifully on the lyre, all these things that we were talking about that are the ways that Achilles mirrors the god Apollo. And in this wedding song that is about Hector and Andromache, it says they sang the song of Hector and Andromache, both looking just like the gods. And this is the word that is most often applied to Achilles. Theoekalos is like basically his epithet. At least that's how I've always understood it.
Yeah.
And so it's amazing to see, it's amazing to see Andromache and Hector compared to Achilles at this moment. But of course, we know that just like Achilles, like Hector and Andromache are doomed. So this is a very bittersweet moment to imagine them at the peak of their youth and beauty. They're as beautiful as the gods, but it's not going to last long.
Yeah. It's a sad way to end, but maybe since we have two of the three muses here, they should have the last word.
Yes, I would love that.
It was calling for me, it was calling to mind a passage in Iliad 6, I think it is, where they're saying their farewell, Hector and Andromache, and they are lamenting for, you know, what might be. Hector might die, and then he's lamenting for what might happen to Andromache. So it's a different kind of lament, but I was reminded of that as we were looking at this passage.
It's absolutely a lament. That passage, both Andromache and Hector use the language of lament. So it's quite unusual in Hector's case, because normally lament is something that's performed by women. But as I said in our last session, we're in a kind of unusual situation on the battlefield here. So but also I think the grief of women, and the grief songs of women can be drawn on to express like pain. And there are times in the Iliad when men use it,
Oh, yeah.
and Hector does there too. So it's a perfect comparison to this passage, the passage in Iliad 6.
Helen, did you have anything you'd like to share?
For me, there is also Pindar, which poetry, whose poetry is very much linked to lament at times.
Yes.
Yeah, especially that he brings the music with the olas, with the pipes that he mentions sometimes in his poetry. We might link it to the voices of the women when they are lamenting.
Yes, especially Isthmian 8. So I'm so grateful that you mentioned that, Hélène. So, dear Claudia, I have a question for you. Is there any way we can persuade Casey to come back?
I would love that. I think her schedule is difficult the next couple of weeks, but my gosh, would we love to have you back after that?
I would be happy to come back, but I can't come back until, honestly, realistically, I can't come back until October 16th.
Okay.
Well, but I heard October 16th, so that sounds like, let's make it a promise.
Okay.
Oh, perfect, perfect. Thank you so much, Casey, for leading us. I must say,
I'm honored.
and Claudia, you're the chair of this committee. We've got to do a comment where I think a lot of things came together for how many of us are there? 6 of us.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was a great discussion. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I don't think we have anything we need to link to in terms of
No?
outside resources, because it's all right there in the text for us this week. So
Yes.
just please join us next week for our next discussion. And thanks to all our community members for joining us and following along. Thanks, everyone.